In this episode, we're going to make digital signatures feel like a practical tool for trust, because many security decisions depend on being able to answer two simple questions with confidence. Did this data change, and who is responsible for it? Beginners often hear the phrase digital signature and think it means a scanned handwritten signature or a little image pasted onto a document, but that is not what we mean in cybersecurity. A digital signature is a cryptographic method for proving that some data has not been altered and that it was signed using a specific private key. That combination matters because integrity without identity can still allow fraud, and identity without integrity can still allow tampering. Leaders need to understand digital signatures because they are used in secure communications, software trust, approvals, and many workflows where organizations must decide whether to trust what they are seeing. Once you can explain digital signatures in plain language, you can also spot when people are overpromising what they provide or misunderstanding what they can prove. A digital signature is built on asymmetric cryptography, which means it uses a key pair rather than a single shared secret. The signer holds a private key that must be protected, and they produce a signature value that is mathematically tied to the data being signed. Other parties use the corresponding public key to verify that signature. Verification does not require the verifier to know any secret, which is one reason signatures scale well across many users and systems. The crucial detail is that the signature is bound to the content, not just to the identity. If the content changes even slightly, the verification fails, which gives you a clear integrity signal. That is why digital signatures can support trust decisions where you need to know both that the data stayed intact and that it came from someone who controlled the private key at the time of signing. It helps to understand the role of hashing inside a signature, because this is where beginners often get confused. In most signature workflows, the system first computes a digest of the data using a cryptographic hash function, and then the signature operation is applied to that digest rather than to the entire data. This is efficient because hashing produces a fixed-size output even if the original data is huge, and it also strengthens the binding between the signature and the content. When a verifier checks the signature, they hash the data they received and compare it to what the signature implies. If an attacker changes the data, the digest changes and verification fails. The leader takeaway is that signatures protect integrity by ensuring that tampering is detectable, and they do it in a way that remains practical for large files, messages, and documents. You do not have to perform the math to understand the trust outcome. Integrity is the first major property, and you should think of it as tamper evidence rather than tamper prevention. A digital signature does not stop someone from changing the data in transit or at rest. Instead, it ensures that any change will be noticed when verification is performed. This distinction matters because some people mistakenly treat signatures as if they make tampering impossible. In reality, the security comes from the fact that receivers refuse to trust data that fails signature verification. That means the workflow must actually perform verification and must treat failures seriously. If a system accepts and signed data or ignores invalid signatures, it throws away the integrity benefit. Leaders should ask whether signature checks are enforced and whether failure handling is safe, because a signature only helps if the system uses it to make a decision. Authenticity is the second major property, and it rests on the idea that only the holder of the private key could have produced a valid signature for that public key. If you can verify a signature with a trusted public key, you can be confident that the signer possessed the private key at signing time. This supports identity claims, but notice the careful language. You are confident about control of the private key, not necessarily about the human being behind it. That is why identity binding is so important, because a public key must be correctly associated with a person, organization, or service for the signature to be meaningful. This association is often provided through a certificate, which binds an identity to a public key through a trusted issuer. Leaders should understand that when trust decisions depend on signatures, they also depend on certificate validation, key management, and governance around who is allowed to sign. Authenticity is not a free gift. It is the outcome of a whole trust system working correctly. Nonrepudiation is the third concept, and it tends to sound more absolute than it really is, so leaders must use it carefully. Nonrepudiation is the idea that a signer cannot credibly deny having signed a message or document because the signature provides evidence tied to their private key. In practice, Non-repudiation depends on the private key being well protected and on the organization having processes that make key ownership and control defensible. If private keys are shared among multiple people, stored insecurely, or accessible to administrators without controls, then it becomes harder to argue that a particular person must have signed. Even if the math is correct, the real-world evidence becomes messy. Leaders should therefore treat non-repudiation as a goal supported by technical and procedural controls, not as a magical property that exists automatically. The more serious the legal or business consequence, the more important it is to ensure the signing process is well governed, well logged, and tied to a clear identity. Digital signatures also rely on trust decisions about the public key, because verification is only meaningful if you trust that the public key belongs to the claimed identity. This is where certificate chains and trust stores matter, even if you never manage them directly. A verifier typically trusts a set of root certificate authorities and uses them to validate a certificate presented with a signature. Validation includes checking that the certificate is signed by a trusted issuer, that it is within its valid time period, and that it has not been revoked. Leaders should understand that verification is not only checking the signature math, it is checking the trust path behind the public key. If a system skips certificate validation or accepts self-asserted keys without careful trust anchoring, attackers can substitute their own keys and produce signatures that verify under those substituted keys. The cryptography would still work, but the trust decision would be wrong, which defeats the purpose. This is why leadership attention to trust foundations matters. A practical way to see the power of digital signatures is to consider one-to-many verification scenarios. If one organization publishes something that many others must trust, digital signatures allow that publisher to sign once and allow many recipients to verify independently. This is useful for things like software distribution, signed updates, and policy documents where integrity and authenticity matter. The recipients do not need to share a secret with the publisher, which reduces the complexity and risk of secret distribution. Instead, recipients need a trusted way to obtain the publisher's public key, often via certificates and trusted authorities. Leaders should appreciate how this supports scale, because it reduces coordination overhead while still providing strong evidence. It also supports a cleaner trust model, where signing authority can be tightly controlled while verification remains broad and easy. That is a good pattern for governance because it naturally encourages separation between those who can approve and those who can check. It is also useful to contrast digital signatures with message authentication code, MAC, because confusion between them is common. AMAC uses a shared secret key, which means both the sender and receiver can generate the same authentication value. That provides integrity and authenticity between those two parties, but it does not support non-repudiation because either party could have generated it. With a digital signature, only the signer's private key can generate the signature, and anyone with the public key can verify it, which supports broader trust and stronger attribution. Leaders should recognize that the right choice depends on the trust model and the workflow. If two systems share a secret and only need mutual assurance, AMAC may fit. If many parties need to verify content and attribution matters, digital signatures are often a better match. Understanding the difference helps you answer exam questions that test whether you can choose the right trust mechanism for the situation. Digital signatures also connect to auditability because they create a strong piece of evidence that can be logged and reviewed. When a system records that a certain action was signed by a certain key at a certain time, you get a trail that supports investigations and accountability. However, the quality of that trail depends on logging practices and on-time accuracy. If logs are incomplete or can be tampered with, the evidence becomes less persuasive. Leaders should therefore treat signed actions and logging as a combined system, where signatures provide cryptographic assurance and logs provide operational context. This is especially important in workflows like approvals, configuration changes, or data releases, where accountability is part of security. A strong signature without a strong record of how it was used can still leave questions unanswered. Trust decisions become easier when cryptographic evidence and operational evidence reinforce each other. A major failure mode for digital signatures is private key compromise, because compromise lets an attacker sign malicious content that appears legitimate. This is why key management is inseparable from signature trust. If a signing key is exposed, the organization may need to revoke certificates, replace keys, and communicate trust changes quickly. Leaders should understand that revocation and rotation are not optional administrative chores. They are the emergency brakes that protect the trust system when something goes wrong. Another failure mode is weak verification enforcement, where systems verify signatures in some paths, but not in others, creating loopholes attackers can exploit. A third failure mode is trusting the wrong certificate authority or failing to validate certificate chains properly, which can allow impersonation. These failure modes are common because they arise from operational shortcuts and complexity, not from exotic math attacks. Leadership attention to process, ownership, and monitoring can reduce these risks significantly. Another subtle but important point is that a digital signature is evidence about data at a moment in time, and long-term trust can require additional considerations. If you need to prove years later that something was signed and valid at the time, you may need evidence that the certificate was valid then and that the signing key had not been compromised. This can involve careful record-keeping and, in some environments, the use of trusted timestamps that bind a signature to a time. You do not need to implement these mechanisms to understand the leadership lesson. Trust is not only a technical property, it is a durable business requirement that depends on lifecycle management. When organizations treat signatures casually, they sometimes discover later that they cannot defend a trust claim because they lack the supporting records. Leaders should connect digital signatures to governance, retention, and audit policies, especially when signatures are used for high-impact approvals or regulated actions. Security leadership is about anticipating these long-tail requirements before they become crises. When you step back, digital signatures are best understood as a tool that helps systems and organizations make better trust decisions. They provide integrity by making tampering detectable, authenticity by proving control of a private key, and support non-repudiation when combined with strong key management and clear identity binding. They scale well because verification is widely possible without shared secrets, which makes them useful for one-to-many distribution and broad verification workflows. They also create strong evidence when paired with good logging, which supports accountability and incident response. The biggest risks are not mysterious cryptographic breaks, but operational weaknesses like key compromise, poor validation, and inconsistent verification enforcement. If you can explain these points clearly, you can answer exam questions that test trust reasoning, and you can guide real conversations towards safer designs. By the end of this episode, you should feel comfortable with what digital signatures actually prove and what they do not. They do not stop someone from attempting tampering, but they make tampering visible and actionable when verification is enforced. They do not automatically guarantee a person's intent, but they provide strong evidence of private key control when identity binding and key governance are sound. They help organizations scale trust because they separate the power to sign from the ability to verify, which aligns with good control design. Most importantly, they turn vague trust into a checkable decision, which is exactly what leaders need when they are responsible for risk. As we move forward into hashing and password storage, keep the signature model in mind, because it shows how cryptography becomes useful when it is paired with clear workflows, disciplined key management, and the courage to treat trust as something you must verify, not something you assume.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.